In the ancient city of Isfahan, in the palace of the great king of Persia, the day they had awaited for a whole year had arrived. The sacred holiday of Nowruz. The gardens were drowning in blossoms, and the fountains sang with crystal voices, scattering diamond drops. The air was so thickly saturated with the scents of roses and saffron that it seemed it could be cut with a knife, like sweet halva. The sounds of lutes and drums floated over the marble terraces, and the silks and jewels of the guests sparkled brighter than the stars. On a golden throne sat the wise and just king, and his gaze was full of peace. But beside him stood the one our story is about, his son, Prince Kamar. The young man was slender and brave, yet in his dark eyes burned an unquenchable fire. The fire of impatience and an insatiable thirst for the adventures that were still waiting for him ahead. And so, when the music thundered louder than before, and the dancers spun like petals in the wind, the heavy gates of the throne room swung open, and everything fell silent. On the threshold stood a stranger, an Indian sage of advanced years, in simple white robes, but with a posture so proud as if the mountains themselves bowed before him. His face was weathered by time, and his eyes burned with an intellect as sharp as a blade. He bowed to the king, and at his signal, 4 servants carried into the hall something that took everyone's breath away. A full-sized horse, carved from a single piece of ebony wood, black as a moonless night. Its saddle and harness were studded with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, which flared in the torchlight like living flame. It stood motionless, like a statue, but in its precious eyes, it seemed, hid a spark of life, and its wooden heart waited only for a command to take flight. "O great king," the sage said, and his voice rang out like a taut string, "do not marvel only at the beauty of my horse, for its beauty is the least of its wonders. This horse can fly through the air faster than the fastest falcon." A murmur of amazement rolled through the hall. The sage approached the horse and pointed to 2 small, almost unnoticeable pegs, artfully hidden in the curls of the carved mane. "This one, shaped like a rooster's comb, lifts the horse to the clouds, and this one, in the shape of a ram's horn, returns it to the ground." And before anyone could utter a word, the sage lightly leaped into the saddle and turned the first peg. And the horse of black wood, which knew neither oats nor bridle, floated through the air as easily as a fish swims in water, obeying only the will of its creator. Without a single sound, it soared right under the vaulted ceiling of the hall. The whole court gasped, and Prince Kamar watched this miracle, holding his breath, and his heart beat louder than the festive drums. The sage smoothly lowered the horse to the marble floor and dismounted with a bow. But before he could even open his mouth, a swift shadow darted forward. Prince Kamar, whose young blood was boiling from the miracle he had seen, flew into the saddle of the ebony horse with one agile jump. I must try it, he exclaimed, and his eyes shone with wild, unstoppable delight. Wait, my prince, the inventor cried out, reaching out his hand. Let me explain. But the prince was no longer listening. His youth knew no caution, and his bravery could not endure waiting. His impatient fingers glided over the carved mane, feeling for the coveted pegs. He saddled his destiny just as swiftly as he saddled this magical horse, asking neither for advice nor direction, nor the blessing of his father, whose anxious shout drowned in the roar of the astonished crowd. His fingers found the peg. Kamar turned it, sharply, with force, all the way to the end. And the world exploded. The horse did not just soar. It tore away like an arrow released by the hand of a giant. A black bolt of lightning flashed through the throne room, struck out the open balcony, and pierced the sky. The wind lashed the prince's face. The palace collapsed downward. Roofs, gardens, fountains shrank into a handful of colored pebbles and vanished. Kamar clung to the wooden mane with whitened fingers. His heart pounded right at his throat. He yanked the peg back, but it wouldn't budge. The horse rushed upward, ever higher, ever faster, and the earth melted below like morning mist. He only wanted to touch a miracle, but instead he saddled an uncontrollable bolt of lightning that was carrying him away from the earth, from his home, and from any hope of salvation. Meanwhile, in the palace, the king leaped from his throne. A cry of horror shook the walls. The horse pierced the clouds just as a needle pierces silk, and carried the prince to a place no bird had ever flown. The earth below turned into a colorful map. Cities became grains of sand. Rivers became silver threads, and mighty mountains wrinkled exactly like folds on old fabric. Everything that seemed huge and eternal turned into nothing. The air grew ice cold and thin, like a final breath. Every gasp came with difficulty, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his throat. The sky around turned black, and stars lit up on it. Bright, unblinking, indifferent. He was flying where not even eagles fly, in the icy silence between worlds, and his only companions were these cold, distant lights. Kamar shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization of his own insignificance in the face of endless eternity. He was alone, completely alone, and far below, in the palace where the festive lights were still burning out, the king, maddened with grief, ordered the Indian sage to be seized and thrown into the deepest and darkest of his dungeons. But Prince Kamar was the son of a warrior, and the blood of his fathers knew no submission to fate. In this icy hell, his despair was smelted into a cold determination, and he began to seek not salvation, but control over his flying prison. Numb, disobedient fingers glided over the carved mane. Inch by inch, curl by curl. The cold bit his hands. The wind blinded his eyes. But the prince did not stop. He was searching for that very second peg the sage had spoken of, the small projection in the shape of a ram's horn. And then, right under the horse's ear, his fingers felt it. A tiny, barely noticeable curl. The prince's heart stopped. Carefully, barely breathing, millimeter by millimeter, he began to turn the peg. The horse shuddered. The insane ascent halted, and the black wooden body smoothly, obediently dipped downward. The stars began to recede. The air grew warmer, and a long-awaited breath flooded into his chest. Kamar realized he was no longer a captive. He was a rider, and the sky from now on belonged to him. All night Prince Kamar flew over the sleeping earth, and now his flight was not an escape, but a journey. The obedient horse glided among the clouds, obeying every turn of the coveted peg, while silvery ribbons of rivers, dark carpets of forests, and the lights of distant villages drifted by below. When the first ray of dawn painted the sky the color of a ripe pomegranate, the prince saw below a city of wondrous beauty. White walls, blue domes, slender minarets drowning in the greenery of gardens. It was the capital of distant Yemen. Kamar decided to descend. But he was no longer the reckless youth who had torn into the sky yesterday. Carefully and precisely, like a falcon choosing a branch, he guided the horse toward the most beautiful palace and softly lowered it onto a wide, flat roof, hidden from prying eyes. He descended from the heavens like a quiet night guest, and the stone of a stranger's palace became the first solid ground after the long flight among the stars. Kamar hid the horse in the shadow of the stone parapet and looked around. Curiosity, the eternal companion of youth, was already calling him downward. Who is the master of this palace? Whose gardens smell so sweet in the pre-dawn silence? At the edge of the roof, he found a narrow marble staircase leading down into the half-light, and the prince slipped downward, quietly, like a shadow. Like smoke from an extinguished candle, he walked through someone else's dream, through a palace plunged into silence, and every step he took was a daring intrusion into the mystery that slept behind the next door. The corridors were lined with carpets as soft as clouds, and his feet did not make a single sound. The walls were covered with the finest carvings, and incense smoldered in silver censers, filling the air with the aroma of sandalwood and ambergris. With each step, the furnishings became richer, and Kamar realized he had not just infiltrated a palace. He was approaching the chambers of someone of royal blood. Before the final door, he froze. A soft light streamed from behind it, as if the moon itself was hiding beyond the threshold. Kamar carefully touched the leaf of the door, and it gave way without a sound. The room was flooded with a silvery radiance that poured through a carved window. On a wide bed under an ivory-colored silk bedspread slept a girl, and the prince forgot how to breathe. Her face shone like a full moon on the clearest of nights. the black hair scattered across the pillow was darker than darkness itself, and her long eyelashes rested on her cheeks like the wings of butterflies asleep on rose petals. Her lips were like two pomegranate petals, and her skin glowed as if carved from moonstone. This was Princess Shams, she whose name means sun. Kamar stood in the doorway, struck right to the heart, unable to move. He thought he had seen the stars in the sky, but now he understood. All the stars of the world had gathered here, only to illuminate the face of one sleeping girl. Perhaps the moonlight faltered, or a shadow slipped across her face, but the princess opened her eyes. Seeing a stranger, she cried out and recoiled, her hand darting toward the cord that summoned the guard. "Do not be afraid," Kamar exclaimed, and his voice, full of tenderness, hung in the moonlit air. He dropped to one knee, bowed his head, and began to speak. He told her everything about the Nowruz holiday in distant Isfahan, about the black horse made of ebony wood, about the insane ascent into the icy blackness, where the stars had looked at him without pity. And his words were just as much a miracle as his horse. They effortlessly flew through the walls of her fear, landing right in her heart. The princess's fingers slipped from the cord. The fear melted away, giving way to curiosity, and then to a quiet, timid admiration. They talked until dawn, and when the first ray of the sun touched their faces, both already knew what needed no words. Their hearts had found each other. The sky in the east turned pink, and Kamar realized the dawn would not wait for lovers. "Fly with me," he whispered, taking her hand. "Fly to Persia. Become my wife and my star. My father will accept you as a daughter, and my people as a queen." And Shams, whose heart already belonged to this brave prince who had fallen from the sky, answered without hesitation, "I will fly with you, even to the edge of the world." Quietly, like two ghosts, they went up to the roof. The ebony horse was waiting for them, black and loyal. Kamar sat first and offered his hand to the princess. She settled behind him, wrapping her arms around him. One turn of the peg, and the horse lifted off the stone. The two lovers soared into the morning sky, golden and tender, setting a course for distant Persia. And their love, born in a single night, was just as fast and bold as their flight toward the rising sun. The ebony horse touched down in the middle of the palace garden in Isfahan, and the earth seemed to shudder with joy. The old king, whose eyes had dried up from sleepless nights and prayers, ran out to meet them and froze. Before him stood his son, alive and unharmed, and beside him a girl of such beauty that the courtiers lost the gift of speech. Thus the sun, who had flown toward the stars, returned with the sun on his horse, and the joy in the palace was just as dazzling as the beauty of his bride. The king embraced Kamar, and tears of happiness fell into his gray beard. "Forgive me, father," whispered the prince. "You are forgiven by the heavens themselves," answered the king. In that very hour, he ordered the doors of the deepest dungeon to be opened and the Indian sage to be freed. And throughout Isfahan, trumpets and drums sounded, heralding the beginning of grand preparations for a wedding the likes of which Persia had not yet seen. But not every freed body carries within it a freed soul. The Indian sage stepped out of the dungeon, squinting from the bright light, and bowed to the king with a meek and grateful look. But it was merely a mask, as skillful as his own creations. Beneath it swirled a black, suffocating malice. The days and nights spent in the damp darkness had burned everything out of his heart except resentment. He, the great master who had created a miracle worthy of the heavens themselves, and instead of glory, he received chains. Instead of gold, the squeaking of rats and musty gloom. No, he would not forgive. Never. His eyes, hidden under gray eyebrows, found Princess Shams, and in them flared a cold calculation. Here it was, his revenge. He would take from the prince that which was dearer than all the treasures in the world, and he would take it with the help of his own creation, the horse that these fools had left unattended. And while the music of wedding preparations sounded in the palace, a completely different melody sounded in the dark soul of the inventor. A quiet, ominous melody of revenge. On the day of the wedding, when the entire palace was boiling with joyful chores, and Kamar was busy with tailors and jewelers, the inventor chose his hour. He found Princess Shams alone in the garden, and bowed before her so low that his beard touched the ground. "O most beautiful of brides," he began, in a voice as sweet as honey, in which a stinger was hidden. "Allow an old servant to give you some advice. There is an ancient rite without which no wedding will be truly blessed. You, the future mistress of the magical horse, must rise on it to the heavens, alone, without companions, and thank the good spirits of the air for bringing you your beloved. Only then will the horse acknowledge you and serve you both faithfully and truly." Princess Shams, whose heart was as pure as a mountain spring, listened to him with wide open eyes. She knew no deceit. How could she? To her, having grown up amid love and truth, it never even occurred to doubt the words of the gray-haired sage. "What a beautiful custom!" she exclaimed. He had wrapped his black design in a shining wrapper of piety, and she, without a second thought, accepted this gift, which in reality was a trap. The princess approached the ebony horse with a smile on her lips. The inventor offered her his hand and helped her up into the saddle, obligingly, respectfully, like a loyal servant. "This peg, my lady, is for ascending," he said, while inconspicuously, with one precise movement, he turned another, hidden peg, setting the horse's course for distant Byzantium. Then he sharply twisted the ascending peg and stepped back. The horse rushed into the sky. The princess laughed and waved her hand to the courtyard, joyfully, carelessly, like a bird released into the wild. But her laugh broke off. The horse did not stop. It rushed away, further and further from the palace, obeying neither her pleas nor the desperate hands tearing at its mane. And her flight, which was supposed to be a thanksgiving to the heavens, became a road into a new captivity. And the hand waving farewell turned into a hand begging for help. And down below, Prince Kamar stood, petrified, watching as a tiny dot in the sky carried away all his happiness. And the cry that tore from his chest made the walls of ancient Isfahan shudder. The horse carried the princess over mountains whose peaks scratched the clouds, over seas whose waves looked from above like ripples on blue silk. Shams wept, called for help, but the wind carried her words into the void. Finally, the ebony steed began to descend and set down on a wide marble terrace of a foreign palace, majestic and cold as power itself. No sooner had the princess's feet touched the ground than the inventor appeared nearby. He had been waiting here, having arrived in advance. For deceit always runs ahead of its victim. With false care, he took her by the hand and led her through unfamiliar halls, straight to the throne of the Byzantine king. "O great sovereign," proclaimed the sage, bowing to the ground, "accept this gift, more beautiful than any the world has known." Thus the horse, created in India and stolen in Persia, brought its precious burden to Byzantium, where a new captivity awaited her, gilded, but no less cruel for it. The Byzantine king stepped down from his throne and walked around the princess, just as a merchant walks around a purebred horse at the bazaar. His eyes flared up, not with admiration, but with greed, dark and insatiable. "What a miracle!" he exclaimed, looking over the ebony horse. "And what beauty!" He turned to the inventor, and the latter had already reached out his hands for the reward, but instead of gold, he saw a snarl. "You say, a gift?" the king smirked. "Then know this. Everything that has touched my land belongs to me. Both the horse and the girl are mine by right. And you, old thief, get out of here while your head is still on your shoulders." The guards threw themselves at the sage. He was seized like a vagabond, showered with blows, and thrown out the palace gates like a mangy dog. He thought he was selling a treasure, but found himself a deceived seller, robbed by his very own buyer. Thus greed devoured deceit, and both were left hungry. But the most terrible thing of all was that Princess Shams now found herself in the hands of a man who knew neither honor nor pity. When the heavy doors closed and they were left alone, the king threw off his mask of courtesy, just as one throws off an unnecessary cloak. "You are so beautiful," he said, and his voice was as hard as a verdict, "that I have decided to make you my wife and the Queen of Byzantium." Shams stepped back and tears gushed from her eyes. "I am betrothed to the Prince of Persia," she exclaimed. "My heart is given, and I would rather die than betray him." But the king only laughed, coldly, indifferently, as a man laughs who has never known refusal. To him, her tears were but dew on a flower he had already decided to pluck. "I will give you 3 days," he said, raising 3 fingers. 3 days to think. And after that, a wedding. By force or by good will, but you will be mine. He clapped his hands, and the guards led the sobbing princess away into luxurious chambers with golden walls, and with a door locked from the outside with 3 locks. Left alone, Shams wiped her tears and clenched her fists. No, she would not sob like a caught gazelle. She is the daughter of the king of Yemen, and the blood of warriors flows in her veins. Kamar will find her. She knew this as truly as she knew her own name. But she needs time, and she will get it. A plan was born instantly, daring, desperate, and brilliant. When the maids opened the door the next morning, they saw not a beautiful captive, but a wild, howling creature. Shams was rushing about the room, tearing the precious silks on herself, throwing golden dishes at the walls, and every porcelain jug shattered with a deafening crash. Her eyes were mad, her hair disheveled, and from her throat tore a scream that made the blood run cold. The maids rushed away with a squeal. The king sent the best doctors, but she threw herself at them with the claws of a wild cat, not even letting them touch her hand. Not a single healer could get close to her. She turned her beauty into a weapon and her despair into madness, building around herself an invisible wall that neither a doctor nor a king could break through. And behind the mask of madness burned the clear, calculating eyes of a woman who was waiting for her prince. Meanwhile, in Isfahan, Prince Kamar stood on the balcony, not moving, not eating, and not drinking. He looked at the sky, which just yesterday was the path to his happiness, and now had become a huge empty wall that hid his love. Guilt burned him from the inside like a red-hot coal. It was he who had left her alone. It was he who had not recognized the snake in the guise of a sage. The old king came to him every day. "My son, forget," he said softly. "I will find you a bride more beautiful than the last. The daughters of 100 kings will be happy," but Kamar only shook his head. "For me there is no other father. There is only Shams." On the 3rd night he stood up. His eyes were red from insomnia, but in them burned the former fire, the very one that had once pushed him into the saddle of the ebony horse. Waiting was pointless. The horse could have carried her to the edge of the world. Well then, it means he will walk the whole world on foot. At dawn, Kamar took off his royal clothes, the gold-embroidered robe, the turban with a ruby clasp. and dressed in a simple travel cloak made of coarse wool. He took only his trusty sword and a purse with gold, and left the palace through the back gate like a simple traveler. He traded his wings for dusty roads, ready to walk the whole world on foot, just to find the one who had flown away beyond the clouds. For long months he walked from city to city, from country to country. He questioned caravaneers in the noisy bazaars of Baghdad, merchants in the ports of Basra, fishermen on the shores of distant seas. Have you seen a wooden horse flying through the sky? Have you heard of a beautiful captive? People shook their heads, taking him for a madman. But Kamar walked on, through deserts, mountain passes, and foreign lands, guided by a single star whose name was Shams. Months replaced one another, and hope melted like wax in a fire. Kamar grew thin. His cloak became frayed, and his gold had almost run out. But his feet carried him further, and one day brought him to the gates of the capital of Byzantium. Tired and hungry, he entered a noisy tavern on the bazaar square and ordered a cup of water. At the next table, merchants and artisans were gossiping about palace news. "Did you hear?" said a fat merchant, lowering his voice. "A girl came down from the sky to our king on a wooden horse. Such beauty! You cannot take your eyes off her. The king decided to take her as his wife, but no such luck. She has gone mad. Tears silks, breaks dishes, throws herself at healers like a wild lioness. Not a single doctor can approach her." The cup froze at Kamar's lips. His heart, which had been silent for so many long months, suddenly began to beat so hard that it almost broke through his ribs. A wooden horse, unearthly beauty, madness beyond the control of healers. He smiled, for the first time in all this while. For in the tall tales of a stranger's madness, he heard the clearest and loudest call for help, written in the language of their shared love. His Shams had not gone mad. She was waiting for him. Kamar left the tavern, and his mind worked faster than ever before. He leaned against the wall and began to think, coldly, precisely, like a commander before a decisive battle. Burst into the palace by force? Madness. The guards would hack him to pieces before he reached the gates. Bribe the servants? Too long and unreliable. No, he needed a path that would open all doors before him, both to Shams and to the horse. And then the pieces of the puzzle fell together into a single picture. A mad princess whom not a single doctor can heal. A wooden horse locked in the royal treasury. A desperate king ready for anything for the sake of a wedding. Kamar understood. To steal the princess from a locked cage, one must not break the locks, but force the king himself to open the doors. And there is only one person whom the king would let into her without hesitation. A great healer, capable of curing her ailment. A smile slipped across his chapped lips. He would play the role of a foreign sage astrologer who had appeared from distant lands. The madness invented by Shams would become the key to her own salvation. What beautiful irony! At dawn, Kamar dove into the labyrinth of the Byzantine bazaar and got down to business. With his last gold coins, he bought everything required for his masquerade. A long robe of dark silk embroidered with silver stars and crescents, a tall indigo-colored turban, a bundle of ancient scrolls, and small bags with fragrant herbs, sage, myrrh, and camphor. In the cramped closet of an inn, the transformation began. From goat hair, he fashioned a long gray beard and glued it on with resin. With ash, he drew deep wrinkles on his face, and under his eyes, the dark shadows of sleepless decades. He bent the straight back of a warrior into a submissive, senile bow, and hid his ringing voice behind a creaky, cracked baritone. He hid his youth and strength under the mask of old age and wisdom, preparing to play the main role of his life. Before the dim mirror stood no longer a Persian prince, but an ancient, all-knowing sage whose gaze seemed to penetrate through walls. A hunched old man in a starry robe approached the palace gates and struck his staff against the stone 3 times, imperiously, like someone accustomed to having any doors open before him. The guards crossed their spears. "Who are you, old man?" "I am the greatest healer of the East," sounded a creaky voice, full of calm strength. "I have cured the madness of sultans and the fever of caliphs. Rumors of your sick princess have reached my ears, and I have traveled a long way to help where all others have proven to be pitiful ignoramuses." His main weapon was not magic, but an absolute confidence in his lie, which made the guards look at each other, lower their spears, and send a messenger to the king. The answer came instantly. "Let him in immediately." Kamar entered the throne room, leaning on his staff, and every step he took was measured, like the move of a chess master. The Byzantine king leaned forward from the throne, and in his eyes burned a desperate, hungry hope. "Can you really heal her?" he asked. "I can," answered Kamar, bowing his head. "But first, I must see the sick woman and find out the cause of her ailment." The guards opened the door and recoiled. An animal howl was coming from the chambers. Even the king remained behind the threshold, turning pale. Kamar went in alone. Shams darted toward him, disheveled, wild, terrifying. She threw a pillow at him, overturned a small table, and her scream could have put a whole regiment to flight. For everyone behind the door, this was a fit of indomitable madness. But Kamar did not retreat. He walked toward her slowly, measuredly, making smooth passes with his hands, as if taming invisible spirits. Shams wound up for another swing, and at that moment he was right next to her. She grabbed onto his robe, pretending to try and bite him, while he, leaning right down to her ear, breathed out a single word. "Kamar." She froze. For a moment, for just one tiny moment, Such happiness flared up in her mad eyes that it could have illuminated the entire palace. But she was a worthy ally. The growling returned, quieter, weaker, and she went limp, allowing the healer to sit her down on the bed. "I see the cause of the ailment," Kamar announced loudly, turning toward the door. Kamar came out of the chambers, leaning heavily on his staff, and wiped his forehead with his sleeve, as if he had withstood a battle with an invisible enemy. The king rushed to him. "Well, what is wrong with her?" "O great sovereign," Kamar said in a voice full of gloomy solemnity, "her ailment is not bodily. No herbs and ointments will help here. This girl is possessed." The king turned pale. "Possessed by a powerful and evil jinn," continued the false healer, lowering his voice to an ominous whisper. "This jinn is tied to the wooden horse on which she descended from the heavens. It is he who drove her mad. And as long as the horse is nearby, the jinn will torment her mind, knowing no mercy." The king gripped the armrest of the throne. He had invented a jinn to hide a true love. And the king believed this lie more willingly than he would have believed the truth. For a superstitious mind will always prefer a monster to a simple explanation. "Is there any hope, sage?" the king croaked. Kamar held a long, calculated pause, and then slowly nodded. "There is hope, O sovereign, but I will need both the girl and the horse at the same time." "Tell me what I must do," exclaimed the king, and in his voice sounded a plea unworthy of a monarch. But Kamar did not even bat an eyelid. "Listen carefully, O sovereign," he said, raising a finger to the ceiling. "For the slightest mistake will awaken the wrath of the jinn. This is dark, ancient magic, and it can only be performed under the open sky, where the spirits of the air will help me in battle. Tomorrow at dawn, order the wooden horse to be brought out to the largest square in the city." The king nodded, greedily catching every word. "Then bring the princess and seat her in the saddle. For the jinn must return to the very cradle from which he came. I will light a ring of sacred fire around them and read the spells of banishment taught to me by my teacher in the mountains of Tibet." "It will be done." The king slammed his fist on the throne, not suspecting that he was signing the order for his own defeat. He was dictating the plan of his own escape to the king, calling it a recipe for healing, and the king, without knowing it, became the main helper in the abduction of his own bride. Kamar bowed, hiding a smile in his gray, fake beard. At dawn, the main square of Byzantium turned into a huge, open-air theater. The king kept his word, and even surpassed it. The ebony horse was solemnly brought out from the royal treasury and placed right in the center of the square. Its diamonds and rubies flared in the rays of the morning sun, and the crowd gasped as one person. Around the horse, the guards laid out a wide ring of firewood and incense, exactly as the healer had ordered. Thousands of people filled the square from edge to edge. Merchants abandoned their shops, artisans their workshops. Women lifted children onto their shoulders, boys climbed onto roofs. The king in golden armor stood in the front row, surrounded by grandees and guards. Everyone was waiting for a miracle. Everyone looked at the center of the square. No one could even imagine that the square had turned into the stage of the most daring escape in the history of Byzantium, and that they all were spectators who had bought a ticket to their own fooling. The princess was led out from the palace gates. Shams played her part flawlessly. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes wandered. Incoherent wails tore from her throat. The servants, pale with fear, with difficulty seated her in the saddle of the ebony horse, while she scratched and howled so much that the crowd backed away. Then he walked out onto the square. Kamar stepped slowly, solemnly, carrying heavy copper censers before him, from which poured thick, spicy smoke. He played his role with such mastery that even magic itself could have believed his words, let alone a gullible crowd. He walked around the horse, once, twice, a third time. His lips muttered non-existent spells in a language that did not exist. His hands traced mysterious signs in the air, and the smoke from the censers rose to the sky in bizarre pillars, enveloping the horse and rider in a ghostly cloud. The square froze. Thousands of people held their breath. The king leaned forward, clutching the hilt of his sword. Not a whisper, not a sigh, only the crackling of coals and the echoing voice of the sage, sounding over the quieted city like the voice of destiny itself. Kamar struck a flint, and the censers flared up all at once. Smoke poured out of the copper bowls, thick, white, heavy, like milk spilled into the air. It smelled of resin, camphor, and something intoxicating that made the head spin and the eyes water. The billows grew, widened, devouring space, and a moment later, the center of the square disappeared. The horse, the princess, and the healer dissolved in an impenetrable fog. The king lunged forward. "What is happening? I cannot see anything." From the white shroud, an imperious voice struck like thunder. "Not a step, O sovereign. The smoke blinds the jinn. If you approach, he will leave the girl and possess you." The king recoiled as if he had been struck. The grandees backed away. The guards froze, not daring to move. The fear of an invisible jinn turned out to be stronger than any chains. He had created a fog of herbs and lies, and this fog turned out to be denser than any prison wall, hiding them from the eyes of a whole army. No one saw what was happening in the white cloud. No one heard how behind the wall of smoke a quiet voice whispered, "Hold on tight, my Shams." In the thick white fog, the decrepit healer died, and in his place was reborn a young prince, ready to take back his treasure. Kamar acted with lightning speed. Off flew the starry robe. Off went the gray beard and turban. His movements were as precise as the strikes of a blade. One jump, and he was in the saddle, behind Shams's back. The princess was no longer screaming, growling, or thrashing about. The madness fell away from her like a cast-off coverlet. She turned around, and her eyes, clear, shining, full of tears of happiness, met his eyes. "Hold on tight, my love," he whispered. Shams pressed against him and wrapped her arms around him, tightly, as a drowning person grasps at a rescuing shore. Behind the wall of smoke, the crowd buzzed, the guards clanked, the king's voice strained. But here, in the white cloud, there was only their world. Quiet, ready to take flight. Kamar's fingers rested on the coveted peg in the horse's mane. One turn of the peg, and the black horse rushed upward. It pierced the smokescreen just as a spear pierces a shield, and burst into the clear morning sky. Sparkling, swift, unstoppable. The sun struck the diamonds of its harness, and for a moment it seemed as though a black comet with a fiery tail had flown into the sky, and down below, the wind dispersed the remains of the smoke, and the square saw the truth. No healer, no mad captive, only an empty space, scattered censers, and high in the sky, against the backdrop of golden clouds, the silhouette of the magical horse, carrying away two young, happy, laughing lovers. The king threw his head back and opened his mouth, but could not utter a word. The guards squeezed their spears pointlessly. Thousands of people stood with upturned faces, realizing that they had been audaciously, brilliantly, and with absolute impunity, completely fooled. And while the king in the square swallowed the smoke of his defeat, they swallowed the fresh wind of freedom, flying away into the sky, right from under his crowned nose. And their laugh, ringing and happy, echoed for a long time over the quieted Byzantium. The ebony horse carried them over the world, obedient and loyal. And the wind sang them a song understood only by those who have known separation and found each other again. Seas flashed by below like blue saucers, deserts like yellow scarves, and mountains parted as if bowing to the lovers. And when the setting sun painted the sky the color of molten gold, Shams touched Kamar's hand and whispered, "Look." Below lay Isfahan, its gardens, its domes, its fountains sparkling in the last rays of the day. Home. The horse softly sat down on the very balcony from which this whole incredible journey had once begun. The old king came out of the doors, aged, grayed, bent under the weight of grief. He raised his eyes, saw his son, and his legs gave way. "Father!" Kamar caught him. The king embraced them both, his son and daughter-in-law, and began to cry, unashamed of his tears. Thus ended their flight, which had begun with childish curiosity and ended with a grown-up heroic deed, returning to the palace not only a son, but also long-awaited happiness. That very evening, a wedding was celebrated in the palace of Isfahan, so magnificent that it was spoken of from India to the Maghreb. Prince Kamar and Princess Shams became husband and wife to the sounds of 1,000 lutes and the blessings of 1,000 guests. And the magical horse, made of black ebony wood, was placed in the deepest and most guarded treasury of the palace, behind 7 doors and 7 locks, so that never again would anyone's evil will saddle this miracle. Years passed. The old king went to his forefathers, and Kamar took his throne. Wise, just, and beloved by the people. And next to him always sat Shams, his son, his star, his bravery, and they ruled happily ever after, having proven to the whole world that the fastest horse will not save one from betrayal, but the sharpest sword cannot compare with a sharp mind, and the most daring trickery can only be born from the greatest love. And that is the end of the fairy tale, and well done to whoever listened.